know what to say about them. Then, in 1961, people began finding more of these things and collecting them, just as kind of a local phenomena in Peru. Now, you have to understand, Peru has a lot of ancient history. The Inca, not Ica, Inca Indians, and some of these other Indian tribes down there, you know, have a lot of pottery and stuff. And if you're caught selling what's called the Peruvian national treasure without a permit, in other words, you got to pay the government, you know, so they get their cut out of it, you go to jail. A Peruvian jail sentence is the equivalent to an American death sentence. You go to jail, you last about 2 years down there. Just horrible conditions. So, one farmer who's been finding these stones on his property and selling them to Dr. DeCara, for instance, or other people, you know, souvenir hunters. Wow, look at this, rock with dinosaurs and humans on there. He's been selling these things. He's finding them. He doesn't tell people where he finds them because, of course, they're going to go steal them, you know, out of this grave. But he was put on TV in front of the camera, and they were interviewing him. Some media thing was saying, you know, tell us about these stones you have with dinosaurs and humans on there. Right behind the camera were 2 Peruvian police officers waiting for him to say, I'm finding them and selling them, so they could arrest him. So instead, the farmer stood on the camera and said, oh, I make these stones and sell them. It's a hobby of mine. So they said, would you please make some for us right here? And so he carved one, and it was a horrible, like a child's picture compared to real artwork, you know, and nothing at all similar to these stones he's, you know, selling. Also, they analyzed these stones and found out they have an oxidized coating. Most materials, over time, they oxidize. It reacts to the oxygen in the air, and they develop a coating on it. Your car does the same thing. You know, the paint starts to lose its shine as it gets an oxidized coating, and use rubbing compound to get that off and shine it back up. Well, these stones have an oxidized coating that would take a minimum of 200 years to develop that much oxidation. So nobody's making these in the last 200 years. Now, why would anybody make 50,000 stones? Don't they have something else to do with their time than sit around and carve dinosaurs and humans together? The other interesting thing about these stones, we'll get into more of that later, is the dinosaurs that are on there have circles on the side. Nobody has ever seen dinosaur skin, because when you find a dinosaur in the ground, you find the bones. Okay, the rest is rotted away. So nobody knew for sure what dinosaur skin looked like until 1992 or 3, I believe. Somebody in Bolivia found fossilized dinosaur skin. And guess what? There were Rosetta patterns, circles. The scales were arranged in like nodules on the side. They actually had circles on them. There's no way they could have known that when they made these stones, because the skin was just discovered in the last 10 years. Carl Baugh has the piece of dinosaur skin in his museum in Texas, the one that was found. I met the missionary, I met the wife of the missionary, or the best friend of the missionary or something, who found it down in, I believe it was Bolivia or Peru. Bolivia, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, we'll get into more of that later. Okay, so that's about the dinosaurs and humans living together. Next class, we'll talk about dinosaur and human footprints. I've read all the controversy for and against this, and we're going to explain the whole thing about the truth, what I consider to be the truth about the dinosaur and human footprints in our next class. Thank you for joining us. Class number 2 of Creation Science 102. We're continuing where we left off. Last week we talked a little bit about the giant insects that are found. Who remembers a little bit from last week about the, what's a problem that with giant insects today? What would be a problem why they couldn't survive? Who remembers? Yes, sir?
Not enough atmospheric pressure.
Not enough pressure. What does the pressure have to do with the size of an insect?
They breathe through their skin.
They breathe through their skin, right, and they just don't have enough skin compared to the size, the volume of their body. Okay, now we're going to talk about what happened in Glen Rose, Texas. If you go to Dallas and head over to Fort Worth and drop south, west, about 45 miles, you'll see the town of Glen Rose, Texas. It's yellow there on the map. Glen Rose, small town, about 2,000 or 3,000 people, I believe. The river that runs right through town is called the Paluxy River. Now, the Paluxy is the second to the fastest moving river in Texas. They gauge rivers by how far they drop per mile. If it runs 1 mile, how far does it drop? The Mississippi, for instance, in 1 mile drops 8 inches. 8 inches of drop for a mile of river. The Paluxy drops 17 feet per mile. So it's, I don't know what the fastest one is, but it's the second to the fastest moving river in Texas. The problem with this type of river is when you get a lot of rain in a hurry, you get flash floods. These kind of rivers flood easily, and the Paluxy floods very easily, and they're working on projects about putting dams every so often to prevent this flash flooding. But in 1908, there was a flash flood in Paluxy. They said the water was 27 feet above flood stage, and it went roaring through the area and just destroyed the bottom of the river. Now, I've been to the Paluxy. You've not been there yet, have you, Eric? You need to go there sometime. But been there 3 times. The whole area is layers of limestone, which is a rock a little softer than concrete, but roughly similar to concrete. Thick layers of limestone all over this area. And the Paluxy River bed is on top of one of these layers of limestone. So the river is basically flat all the way across. Most rivers, as you walk in, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and then more shallow and more shallow. Oh, not the Paluxy. You jump in, and if it's 2 feet deep, it'll be 2 feet all the way across. That's the way the river is. Okay. Well, in 1908, this river flooded, and the water went roaring through there 27 feet above flood stage and ripped off a layer of limestone. This layer of limestone that was pulled off on the bottom exposed another layer underneath. You can see there the people standing next to the exposed layer, just about a 2-foot drop in limestone there. The layer underneath contained thousands of dinosaur footprints. There were so many footprints there, they decided years later to make it a state park. But at first, in 1908, the local people, it was kind of an oddity. Hey, come see the footprints here. And nobody knew much about it. They didn't care much about it. Outsiders in the rest of the world didn't know. In the early 30s, during the Depression, one of the work projects here in America to keep people working, to give them a job, they sent some people there to Paluxy River to chisel out large blocks of these footprints. The American Museum sent a group down there, headed by a guy named Roland T. Bird. Roland Bird was in charge of the project. They would sandbag the river, pump out the water, because it's generally, only a foot deep or so. It's not a lot of water normally, except during rainy season. But if you go there in the summer, oftentimes it dries up completely. There's no water at all. But they sandbagged it, pumped the water out, found some sections of dinosaur tracks, and sawed them out. Now, they broke them up into hundreds and hundreds of pieces and numbered all the pieces, loaded these chunks onto a truck, took them to museums, and reassembled the pieces like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Took a long time to do this. Here's the guys, you can see them right behind this section of tracks they're about to chisel out. They reconstructed the tracks, fixed all the seams that they had made, and put them in museums. Quite a few museums around America have sections of tracks, or at least a few tracks from the Paluxy River. One of the reasons for taking the tracks out of the river and putting them in a museum is Glen Rose is way out of the way. Not many folks go there. Okay? Better to have them in a museum where people can see them. Secondly, the river was going to continue to destroy these tracks. Erosion would ruin them eventually. And so this preserves them for people to see. Here's the famous photo of the little boy taking a bath in a dinosaur footprint. The Tommy Pendley photo, it's called. They said he was very reluctant when they said, would you like to take a bath? Little boys are about baths, but finally they said, well, you get to wear your clothes and get in the footprint. Oh, okay. So he sat down and they took this photo of Tommy sitting in the dinosaur footprint. Roland Bird went down there in 1930. He was the field explorer for the American Field Museum. He reported that there were 15 to 20 inch long, clearly defined human footprints. Now they didn't make much, don't talk about this much anymore. Here's a copy of one of those footprints. Now this one is pretty badly eroded, believe it or not. What you see are the little pock marks all over the footprint. Many of these footprints, when they were first discovered in the 1908 to 1930 era, they were so clear you could see what are called the dermal ridges. Your fingerprints have little raised areas of skin called the fingerprint. You have the same thing on your toes. Only they don't call them a fingerprint. It'd be a toe print or a dermal ridge. Some of these tracks were so clear you could actually see the dermal ridges on the foot. There was one trail of footprints across there. They called it the moccasin trail because it was so clear when it was originally exposed you could see the stitching where they sewed the moccasins together. where they sewed the pieces of leather together to make their moccasins. It's just extremely clear tracks. Well, of course, within a few years, they begin to look like this instead. The clarity begins to disappear. There have been all sorts of people go down there to study these footprints. This is a picture of the Taylor Trail taken by Don Patton. The picture was taken in 1999. Still, recognizable human footprints crossing right over a dinosaur trail. Some of the tracks are still visible. Now what they've done to these tracks to make them show up like this, they say they're wet out. They dry the area out, and then they go through and find the depressions where the footprints are and pour them full of water. That way they show up better on the picture. I suppose it's theoretically possible to take water and paint an area to look like a footprint, even though it's not a depression. But these are the tracks that they have just filled in the low places, and it makes the shape of a human foot. If you put your foot in there on some of the smaller ones, it'll fit perfectly. I've been there 3 times and walked in them. It's pretty incredible. A guy who owned a lot of this property died, I'm going to say he probably died in 1990, I don't know, quite a while ago. His name was Emmett McFall. Emmett McFall owned a lot of the property where the river runs across. When I stopped there with my students from Texas, Longview, Texas, we took a bus over there to see these things. Emmett McFall gave us a tour around the riverbed and took us and showed us where the tracks are. And we walked in them. He's the one who sold me the toe bone that I have, the dinosaur toe bone. He had found some bones of dinosaurs. He had a whole bunch of strange stuff sitting on tables there that, people, visitors could come and look at and buy. A real friendly guy. He took us out in the bus and showed us all these things. Well, these footprints have taken a lot of flack even from some creationists. So I want to give you the story of the footprints tonight so that when you speak on this, people will be able to tell you. One of the times that I was there in Texas, a guy came to meet us when we went to the local store to get some Coke or something, and he said, my name is Cecil Daughtery. I heard you're here looking at the footprints. I said, Cecil Daughtery, are you the one that wrote this book? He said, yes, I am. Dr. Cecil Daughtery was a chiropractor who lived there for 17 years in Glen Rose. He spent all of his spare time out photographing footprints, human and dinosaur footprints together. Some of the best pictures that we have of this area, and the whole story is in this book, The Valley of the Giants by Dr. Cecil Daughtery. The footprints, he has a map here showing where the different man tracks are located. Now the guy's a chiropractor. He knows a little bit about the human body and about stride, how far your steps should be, and about the shape of your foot, when you land on your heel, and what a footprint should look like. I mean, this was his study for years. And he studied these things very carefully and was convinced they are indeed obvious human footprints. Then John Morris from Institute for Creation Research, Henry Morris's son, John Morris, spent a lot of time there and wrote this book, saying, yep, there are definitely human footprints there. I sat across the table from John Morris several years ago when I spoke at ICR, and I said, John, why did you withdraw your book? He no longer sells the book. He says, Brother Hovind, I've got a whole warehouse full of those books, and I'd love to be able to sell them. He said, but I just cannot in good conscience continue to support the footprint idea in Texas. There was a movie made called Footprints in Stone by, I forget which group made that movie, but that movie went around the circuit for a while showing the dinosaur and human footprints together, and then they withdrew their movie off the market. So you'll get some people who will give you some flack and say, oh, the creationists don't support those human footprint ideas anymore. Well, here's the points that I would make on this. You might want to write these down. Number one, nobody has ever found human and chicken footprints in the same rock strata. Does that prove humans and chickens did not live at the same time? Obviously not. Chickens are still alive today, right? So you don't need to find the footprints together, first of all. Number two, if a few dinosaurs are still alive, then you don't need to find their footprints together. Okay? So the whole idea is sort of a moot point. It doesn't matter in one sense whether there's footprints or not. I believe there are, and I'll get into my evidence for that. But we don't have to find their footprints together to prove they live together. If we find dinosaurs on artwork, like we showed last week about the Ica stones, and we'll get into a lot more on that later about dinosaurs, I think the fact there's obvious evidence from many lines of reasoning that they live together. We certainly have the scripture which teaches us God made everything in 6 days. So the Bible would indicate very clearly that everything was made at the same time and man lived with dinosaurs. So I think the whole argument about the human footprints and dinosaur footprints, though it is still very legitimate, is unnecessary in one sense to prove our point. Okay. I asked John Morris why they withdrew their support, and he said, well, our best human footprint turned into a dinosaur track. Here's what happened. On the back of this book, Texas Tracks and Artifacts, is a drawing, our artist's conception, of a guy running, stepping in the footprint of a dinosaur. Now, if you ever walk through deep snow or walk through mud, the logical place to step is right where somebody else already stepped. You follow their footprints, okay? Some of the footprints were right on top of dinosaur footprints when they were found. A few others were found where the trails crossed, where the dinosaur track was on top of the human track, or on top of part of the human track. Now what would that prove if the dinosaur track is on top of the human track? What does that prove? The dinosaur was there last, right. Sometimes the human track is on top of the dinosaur track. One of the best tracks was, about 8 inches deep in what they call the marl, the limestone. Squished down in there, you look down in there and you see this beautiful human footprints down in the mud. You can see the dermal ridges, everything. Over the years, it gradually begins to get worn out. Pretty soon it starts to get distorted where you can no longer see the clarity of it. And then gradually the toe distinction will disappear and you end up just with an oval-shaped depression. As this track eroded away, it turned into a dinosaur footprint, a 3-toed dinosaur. And the human track was right in the middle. Now it was a big oval-shaped depression. And they said, oh, that was never a human track. It was a dinosaur track all along, and the mud squeezed over the toes, and we just didn't see those outer toes. Because if you step in mud and lift your foot out, there's a chance some of the mud will, squeeze in and distort some of the track, and it was pretty deep into the mud. Well, the truth of the matter is, it was both all along. A human stepped on top after the dinosaur stepped there. Mud squeezed in, covered these outer toes, and then over the years, the mud that was covering it eroded away, exposing the other 2 toes. But because of that fact right there, that's one of the reasons that a few of the people, not all of the people, but a few of the people at ICR withdrew support of the human and dinosaur footprints together. Now, the most recent book on the subject is this one, Texas Tracks and Artifacts. These guys have spent a lot of time researching it. You need to understand what the problem is now with the tracks. The ones that have been exposed for 80 years or 90 years, of course, are destroyed, eroded. The ones that have been cut out and saved in museums someplace, the scoffers are going to say, how do we know those came from the river? So you can't win either way, all right? Even though they videotape while they're excavating these things, they document it, they bring in the news media. Carl Ball lives there. Has a museum there and owns part of the property and has studied this for years and years and years. That's where his museum is. Now, if you go to Glen Rose, there are 2 museums. You need to be very careful. One teaches evolution and will say there aren't any human tracks out here. If you go to the state park, they will say, oh, there's no human tracks. Who's spreading that propaganda? But if you go half a mile down the road to Carl Ball's museum, you can see the copies of the footprints, the photographs, all the video footage of as they've done all this. What they've done, since the tracks in the river get destroyed by the weather, they will, since they know where the trails are, they have them marked, where the different trails of human tracks are. You can see it in the different books. They go to the river to the edge of the river, chisel out some more rock. There's more footprints underneath. The trail continues under the rock. And they've been doing that for years, exposing more footprints. Dr. Ball has done many digs down there, exposing more human footprints and more dinosaur footprints in this region. Well, finally they now have said you can't dig into the creek bank because creeks have rights. Oh, brother, environmentalists, I give them a hard time. They'll say, trees have rights and creeks have rights. And I say, yep, and oxygen molecules have rights and you ought to quit breathing. That's what I tell them. They don't know what to say to that. But the books on the subject, if you want to read a lot more, would be this one, The Valley of the Giants by Dr. Daugherty. I don't know if it's still in print. There's a phone number in the front cover if you want to try to get that. Texas Tracks and Artifacts we offer through our ministry here. It's the most recent update on the tracks, including lots of maps and interesting information. about the human footprints. And this one is out of print. They still have a warehouse full of them. You might talk them into selling you one. I don't know. You could call ICR and say, can I buy that book tracking those incredible dinosaurs? I don't think they sell them or will sell them. Now, several people from ICR in recent months have gone to Texas and are looking at this situation again and saying, hey, to my knowledge, Dwayne Gish has always supported the idea. And Henry Morris, I believe, still supports the idea. There's a few folks there who do, a few folks there who don't. Doesn't matter to me. I've been there myself. I've seen it. Joe Taylor has a fascinating museum in just out in Crosbyton, Texas, near Amarillo, West Texas. Joe Taylor has spent a long time studying the tracks there also. And you might want to get this book, Fossil Facts and Fantasies, by Joe Taylor, where he goes, we offer this through our ministry also. That'd be a good one for you to read, Eric. Okay. The tracks vary in size. Some are just normal human size, size 8, 10, 12. This one is a size 24, the one that I have a casting of. Now this casting shrank a ½ inch when the aluminum cooled. This is cast in aluminum. So we have made a high-density styrofoam copy of this, which we sell in our ministry here, if you'd like one to hang on the wall for a conversation starter. The high-density styrofoam one is exact same size and much lighter to carry around. This is a real nuisance to haul around in the suitcase, which I've done for years to put on display for the kids to step in. The biggest track they found, I believe, was 24 inches long. This was 17 inches. 24-inch track would be size 35 or something. I don't know. Pretty big. I understand there's some basketball player, Lanier or something like that, that has a size 31 shoe or 33 or something like that. Shaquille O'Neal is a 24 or size 22. Shaquille's is almost this big, not quite. I was at a church one time and there was a kid who had a size 18. He just almost filled it up. So there are people today with feet this big. The difference between this one and modern people today with feet that size, this one's wider. Well, anybody that goes barefoot all their life gets a wider foot. You wear shoes all your life, your foot stays a little narrower than it does if it can spread out, as you walk barefoot. So they've done a lot of excavations there in this region. They've even taken some footprints and sawed them across. You can see where they sawed this one across the toes and across the heel of the foot. And when they look at it endways, they see the mud has squeezed up between the toes. Now some people have argued, like Kurt Wise from Bryan College, a very smart man and loves the Lord and is a young earth creationist, but he doesn't go along with the footprints there because he thinks that you can see these marl lines other places as you cut through. These little lines, these curves as if it was squeezed up into the toes. He said you see that all through the rock. That doesn't prove a thing. That's his point. Okay? So you may not get any support from him if you go to that region, but he's on our side. He's a smart guy. The steps, though, that were found in Texas, in some instances, were 6 or 7 feet between steps. The guy would be probably 8 or 10 feet tall. My normal stride is about 3 feet. If I'm running, of course, it's more. If a guy's 10 feet tall, his normal stride would probably be 6 feet without a problem. Here's Dr. Baugh, a picture with him showing dinosaur and human tracks together, just a few inches away from each other. I was preaching in Arizona. The associate pastor of the church came to me and said, Brother Hovind, I grew up in Glen Rose. And he told me a story. I said, brother, I want you to put this in writing because people don't believe me. I've got to document everything I say. The scoffers will strain at a gnat in something the creationists say, and then they swallow the camel like believing we're related to a rock, 4.5 billion years ago. I don't know how they can do that. But here's what this guy said. His name is David Smith, associate pastor, First Southern Baptist Church in Cottonwood, Arizona. There's phone number and address and all that stuff right there. He said, Mr. Hovind, I grew up in Glen Rose. He said, I went on an excavation with Dr. Carl Baugh, who lives there. We followed the footsteps of a man which were beside a dinosaur's footprints. It was as if the man were walking with the dinosaur. Nova was there to film the dig. There was also an evolutionist there who had been arguing with Dr. Baugh the entire time. Nova didn't film much of the tracks or our dig, but they did interview this evolutionist. Now Nova, in case you don't know, is a science program. I come on TV once in a while, they show Nova. It means a star that explodes is called a nova. If a big star explodes, they call it a supernova. So it just means an exploding star. In Spanish, nova means won't go, will not move. So the Chevy Nova that sold up here in America, when they took it to Mexico to try to sell it, they had a very hard time selling the car. Would you like to buy a no-go? Oh, I don't think so. Had to put a new name on it or something down there. But, okay, Nova is a TV program that does stuff on science. Nova came to film the interview with this evolutionist and Dr. Baugh, and supposed to film the tracks, report on it. He said he told them he had not seen anything there to disprove evolution. What he didn't tell the camera was that he had refused to even turn around and look at the tracks we had been working on. This associate pastor told me, he said, Brother Hovind, we would dig out the tracks, we would tap this guy on the shoulder and say, sir, look at this. He would say, I don't want to see it. There can't be human tracks here. He wouldn't even look at it. So then he told the camera, I've not seen anything here to disprove evolution. Well, of course not. You wouldn't turn around and look at it. See, in some people's minds, their theory is so important. Any evidence against it, you know, they can't tolerate that thought. It's called in the theory of cognitive dissonance. You run into this when you deal with any of the cults. When you start to prove what they believe is wrong, their brain just rejects it. Can't be true. Of course, you know, I've been taught this all my life. It has to be true. And we all are probably guilty of that, and you have to constantly guard against that. Okay, this guy continues. He said, this man stood with his back to the dig and the tracks while making these statements. Nova knew this man had not looked at the tracks, but they did not report that. Nor did they give Dr. Baugh equal airtime to respond. This is not education, this is indoctrination, and this is the stuff we face all the time. Eric, you get into the debates and you say, these guys are indoctrinated. They're not interested in being educated. They just want to be told what to believe. Okay, one guy said, there must have been a dinosaur then that had feet like a human, if there are human tracks here. That was his reasoning. The petrified hammer that Dr. Baugh has in the museum is pretty fascinating. Battelle Laboratories analyzed it. This was found in 1934 in London, Texas. So it's not in Glen Rose, but it's in the same rock layer that runs through Glen Rose, Texas. This London artifact, they call it, found in 1934. They had already dated the seashells around this hammer at 400 million years old. Part of the handle had turned to coal, and part was petrified. Battelle Laboratories said it was 96.6% iron, 0.26, I can't read, pardon me? 2.6% chlorine and 0.74% sulfur. Well now, my understanding is that their analysis of the hammer revealed there's no carbon, and to make stainless steel you have to have carbon. But the story that I understand is that they were telling Dr. Baugh that you cannot produce this alloy, you can't get these things to combine, unless you do it under a much stronger electromagnetic field. Well, today our magnetic field around the Earth is pretty weak. Your compass still points north, but your body can't tell which way is north. Bees can, and birds can. They can tell which way is north. They just feel it because of the magnetic field. Built-in compass. Probably at the time of the original creation, the magnetic field was about 20 times stronger. We assume that based upon the 300-year study that's been done. In the last 300 years, we've seen the magnetic field of the Earth decline. There's been a 6% decline in 150 years. So that little 6% decline could fit all sorts of curves. You know, I'm not sure, nobody's sure which curve it is, but given the best of circumstances, the magnetic field of the Earth was probably about 20 times stronger. A stronger magnetic field would prevent any meteors from getting in, or most meteors. It would also prevent a lot of radiation from getting in. Everything is focused around the poles. And you could actually feel which way is north, which means you could not get disoriented. You ever been lost? You don't know where you are. Which way do I go? It probably could not happen. See, God thought of everything. When He created the world, He thought of everything. And I suspect